Dad, the optics just aren't right for you to be there. My son Mark's voice was smooth over the phone, the polished tone of a CEO trying to soften a corporate execution. Jessica feels your traditional style might clash with the new brand we're building. It's a next-generation event. I'm sure you understand. Oh, I understood. I understood that traditional style was his code for old, and next generation was his code for mine being over. He didn't know I was sitting in my study, looking at the final signed deed. He didn't know this wasn't just a party. It was a test. And the venue he was so proud of. I had bought it 6 months ago. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of his lesson. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The silence that followed Mark's call was heavier than any argument could ever be. It was a silence filled with unspoken things, with years of moments I had brushed aside, excused, and absorbed like a stone wall absorbs the rain. A next-generation event. The words echoed, not with the promise of progress, but with the finality of an obituary. My generation was over. They had declared it so. I ran a hand over the deed, the paper cool and solid beneath my fingertips. This document, this room, this house. They were all built on a foundation of love and sawdust, a dream I had shared with my late wife, Martha. Martha. Even her name felt like a prayer in this empty house. She was the architect of our joy, the one who saw a home where others only saw a plot of dirt. She believed in legacy, not as something you leave behind in a will, but as something you build into the hearts of your children, brick by loving brick. I leaned back in my leather chair, the one she'd insisted I buy after I sold my first big contract, and let the memories come. They arrived not as a flood, but as a slow, steady tide, pulling me back to a time when the name Grayson meant family, not a brand. Martha had pointed to the horizon, where the sun was setting in streaks of orange and purple. "Right there, David," she'd said, her eyes alight with a fire that could warm the coldest winter. "That's where the kitchen window will go. I want to see the sunset while I make dinner for our family." Family. For her, that word was everything. For me, she was everything. I built that first house with my own 2 hands, every nail a promise, every plank a testament to the life we were creating. When Mark was born, I held him in that very kitchen and looked out that very window. And I understood what she meant. This wasn't just wood and nails. It was a vessel for our future. The company grew from there. Grayson Legacy Homes. Martha chose the name. "Because it's not about houses, my love," she'd explained, her hand on my cheek. "It's about what you pass on. Strength, integrity, a place to call home." I taught Mark everything I knew. I remember his small hand in mine as I showed him how to read a level, the look of intense concentration on his face as he hammered his first nail, crooked but proud. "One day, son," I'd told him, ruffling his hair, "all of this will be yours to lead. But you have to lead it with your heart, not just your head." Where did that boy go? The boy who believed in heart? I think he started to disappear the day he brought Jessica home. She was beautiful, polished, and ambitious in a way that felt like a different language. I welcomed her, of course. I wanted my son to be happy. On their wedding day, I gave her the delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to Martha. It was my way of saying, "You are family now. You are part of this legacy." She smiled, thanked me, and I saw her put it away in its box a few hours later, replaced by a modern diamond pendant her parents had given her. It was a small thing. I told myself it was a small thing. But it was the first time I felt a quiet, chill, a subtle disconnect. The small things started to add up. After Martha passed, the house felt too quiet. The echoes of her laughter were replaced by a profound emptiness. Mark and Jessica suggested I sell it. "It's too big for one person, Dad," Mark had said, his tone gentle. but his eyes held a practical glint I recognized from Jessica. It's a lot of upkeep. You should downsize, travel, enjoy your retirement. Enjoy my retirement. I had retired from the day-to-day operations, handing the CEO title to Mark, but Grayson Legacy Homes was my life. It was my connection to Martha. Selling the house she had designed, the house where we raised our son, it felt like a betrayal. I refused, politely. I saw the flash of annoyance in Jessica's eyes before she masked it with a concerned smile. Their own starter home soon felt too small for their growing ambitions. That's when the pattern began. It was never a direct request. It was a carefully planted seed of need. "We saw the most perfect house over in the Oak Creek development," Jessica would say over dinner, sighing dramatically. "It has a yard for the kids, great schools, but the down payment is just astronomical. I guess we'll be stuck in this tiny place for another decade." Mark would nod, looking defeated. "The market's just crazy right now, and I, like a fool, would step in." "Don't you worry about that," I'd say, my heart aching to see my son look so stressed. "Let me help. A family should have room to grow." I sold the portfolio of stocks Martha and I had painstakingly built, the one we'd earmarked for our own travels, for seeing the world together. I liquidated it without a second thought and wrote them a check for the entire down payment. $250,000. "This isn't a loan," I told them, handing Mark the check. "It's a foundation. Build a good life on it." Mark hugged me, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Dad. I don't know what we'd do without you." Jessica kissed my cheek, her smile radiant. "You're the best father-in-law a girl could ask for." David. They moved in, and for a while things were good. Sunday dinners, holidays. I was the patriarch, the benevolent provider. But then the business started to change. Jessica, with her business degree and modern sensibilities, started having suggestions. "David, with all due respect," she'd said, her voice smooth as silk, "your commitment to using solid oak is admirable, but it's not cost-effective. We could increase our profit margins by 15% if we switch to a high-quality veneer. The clients won't even know the difference." I remember looking at Mark, expecting him to defend the principles I'd taught him. The Grayson name was built on quality, on things that last. But he just shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "She has a point, Dad. We have to think about the bottom line." The bottom line. That became their new mantra. They started cutting corners, small at first, cheaper fixtures, faster construction timelines that sacrificed the meticulous detail we were known for. I voiced my concerns, but I was met with patient smiles and phrases like, "The market has changed, Dad," or "We have to adapt to stay competitive." I was the old-fashioned founder, a relic from a bygone era. They made me feel like my experience was a liability, not an asset. Then came the upgrades to their new house. The foundation I had provided was apparently not enough. "The kitchen is just so dated," Jessica complained one afternoon while I was visiting. "I saw this incredible Italian marble countertop, but Mark says we have to wait until he gets his bonus." She would trail off, leaving the sentence hanging in the air like an unspoken invitation. And I would always accept. I paid for the new kitchen. I paid for the backyard landscaping, complete with a custom-built stone fire pit. I paid for the private school tuition for their 2 children, because the great schools in their district were suddenly not good enough. Each time, it was an investment in the grandchildren's future. Each time, my savings dwindled while their lifestyle inflated. The text messages became their primary form of communication. Not calls, texts, quick, impersonal, and usually preceding a need. "Hey, Dad, the property tax bill came, a little higher than we expected this year. Dad, Sarah needs braces. The orthodontist is quoting a fortune. Hey, the country club membership is up for renewal. Great for business contacts." I became a line item in their budget. a predictable, reliable source of income. And the thanks? It grew shorter, more perfunctory. A quick THX dad text. Sometimes nothing at all. The checks would be cashed, and a week later a new need would arise. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the slow, creeping erasure of my role as a father. I was no longer a source of wisdom or guidance. I was an ATM. My visits to their home started to feel scheduled. I had to call first. Jessica would check their calendar. "Thursday at 4 p.m. for an hour works for us," she'd say, as if I were a plumber coming to fix a leak. I remember one Christmas, I had spent weeks in my workshop carving a beautiful, wooden rocking horse for my grandson, Liam. I poured all my love and memories into it, sanding the wood until it was as smooth as glass. I brought it over on Christmas Eve, my heart swelling with anticipation. Liam's eyes lit up. He was about to climb on when Jessica swooped in. "Oh, David, that's rustic," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "But we just got him the new interactive pony tablet. It has educational apps. We're trying to limit the non-digital toys." She steered Liam away from my gift and towards a brightly lit screen. The rocking horse was moved to a corner of the garage where it gathered dust. I sat there that evening, surrounded by the loud electronic noises of their expensive new toys, feeling more alone than ever. Mark saw the look on my face. He came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "Don't take it personally, Dad," he whispered. "You know how Jessica is about their development. I know how Jessica is." That was Mark's excuse for everything. His shield against confrontation. His quiet surrender. Looking back now, sitting in the silence of my study, I see it all so clearly. The party wasn't a single act of betrayal. It was the final formal announcement of a reality I had been living in for years. I wasn't just uninvited from a party. I had been slowly, methodically, and quietly uninvited from their lives. They just kept sending the bills to my old address. But that's the thing about foundations, the very thing I built my life and company on. If you neglect them, if you take them for granted, they don't just disappear. They wait. And when the time is right, they reveal the cracks in everything that has been built upon them. The deed in my hands wasn't just paper, it was the foundation, and a storm was coming, one that I, for the first time, was going to control. The human heart has a remarkable capacity for hope. It's a stubborn, resilient muscle. Even after years of quiet slights and transactional conversations, a part of me kept hoping. I told myself, it was a phase that Mark was just overwhelmed with the pressures of being a CEO, a husband, a father. I told myself Jessica's ambition was simply a fierce love for her family, expressed in a language I didn't fully understand. I made excuses for them because the alternative, admitting my son had changed, that the legacy I envisioned was crumbling, was too painful to confront. The Next Generation event wasn't the first time I was made to feel like a relic. It was just the most overt. The year before, the company celebrated its 40th anniversary. 40 years. I had started it with a second-hand truck, a box of tools, and a loan I secured with a handshake and a promise. It was a milestone that deserved reverence, a celebration of our history. Jessica, however, had other ideas. She called it a brand relaunch. She had organized the entire event without consulting me. The guest list was filled with tech investors, social media influencers, and brand partners. My old guard, the carpenters, masons, and architects who had bled and sweated alongside me for decades, were not invited. "We need to look forward, David, not back," she'd said, handing me a glass of champagne with a dismissive pat on my arm. They had asked me to give a short speech. I had spent a week writing it, pouring my heart onto the pages, recounting our humble beginnings, honoring Martha's memory, and speaking of the values that had made us who we were. But when I got up to the podium, Mark intercepted me, a tight smile on his face. "Hey, Dad," he'd whispered, his hand on my back, gently guiding me away from the microphone. Jessica thinks it might be better if we keep the speeches brief and future-focused. We've got a video presentation on the new smart home integration. I was ushered back to a small table in the corner, my carefully written speech folded in my pocket, feeling like a guest at my own life's celebration. I watched as a slick, impersonal video played on the big screen, filled with buzzwords like synergy, innovation, and disruption. There was not a single mention of the company's history, not a single photo of me or Martha. It was as if the last 40 years had been wiped clean, replaced by a shiny, hollow new narrative. I was the ghost in their machine. That night, I drove home with the uneaten piece of cake they had given me, the words, "Celebrating a new era," printed on the box. It was a new era, all right, one where history was an inconvenience and loyalty was measured in marketability. The financial requests didn't slow down after that. In fact, they became bolder. They weren't just for necessities anymore. They were for luxuries that I, the man funding them, would never have dreamed of buying for myself. One Tuesday morning, I received a call from Mark. His voice was unusually cheerful. "Hey, Dad. Guess what? Jessica and I are taking the kids to Italy for spring break. Sarah has been studying Renaissance art, and we thought it would be an incredible educational experience." "That sounds wonderful, son," I said, a genuine smile in my voice. I was happy they were creating memories. "I'm sure you'll all have a fantastic time." "Yeah, about that," he said, the cheerfulness shifting to a practiced, casual tone. "The flights and hotels are a bit steeper than we budgeted for. We were wondering if you'd be willing to sponsor the educational part of the trip. You know, for the kids. Think of it as an early inheritance gift. An early inheritance gift." The phrase was so smooth, so well rehearsed, he was asking me for $30,000. Not as a loan, not as help, but as an advance on money he assumed was already his. I remember the silence stretching. I should have said no. Every rational part of my brain screamed it. But then he played his final card. "It would mean the world to Sarah, Dad. She talks about you all the time." And just like that, the stubborn muscle of my heart gave in. I wired the money. I saw the pictures on social media a month later. Jessica in a designer dress, sipping wine, in a Tuscan vineyard. Mark driving a rented Ferrari along the Amalfi Coast. The kids looked happy, but in the background of every photo was the ghost of my own deferred dreams. The trip to see the pyramids Martha and I had always planned. The quiet fishing cabin in Montana I had thought about buying. All of it converted into currency for their curated, picture-perfect life. My own life, in contrast, had become increasingly small. After a minor health scare a few years ago, my doctor advised me to avoid stress. It was nothing serious, but Mark and Jessica used it as a lever. "Dad, you shouldn't be climbing ladders to clean the gutters," Mark would say with feigned concern. "Let us hire a service for you." "You really shouldn't be driving at night anymore," Jessica would chime in. What if something happened? Their concern felt less like care and more like management. They weren't trying to protect me, they were trying to contain me. They hired a lawn service, a cleaning lady, and a grocery delivery service, all paid for from my accounts, of course. They framed it as helping me, but it was really about convenience for them. It meant they didn't have to show up. They could manage my life from a distance, through an app, ensuring the old man was maintained but not present. They slowly chipped away at my independence, making me feel fragile, incapable, and the lonelier I became, the more I found myself. Saying yes to their financial requests because it was the only connection I had left. It was a toxic, unspoken contract. My money in exchange for the illusion of being needed. The final straw before the party, the one that should have warned me, happened 2 months prior. It was my birthday, my 70th, a milestone. I had hoped, foolishly, for a small family dinner. Nothing fancy, Just us. The day came and went. My phone remained silent. No calls, no texts. Not even from the grandchildren. I sat at my kitchen table and ate a bowl of soup alone. Around 9 p.m., a delivery driver knocked on my door. He handed me a small box. Inside was a generic happy birthday fruit basket and a card. The card wasn't even signed by them. It was one of those pre-printed corporate gift cards. The message read, "Thinking of you on your special day. From the Graysons." They hadn't even had the time to sign their own names. They had outsourced their affection. I didn't eat the fruit. I let it sit on the counter for a week, watching it slowly wither and rot. A perfect metaphor for what our relationship had become. Now, sitting in my study, the deed to a property I had never been invited to a party at resting in front of me, all these memories clicked into place. They weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern. A deliberate, systematic campaign to marginalize me, to reduce me from a patriarch to a patron, from a father to a fund. They had built their new brand on my traditional style of funding. They had created their next generation life with my last generation's savings, and they had the audacity to call me the one who would make things uncomfortable. A slow, cold anger began to replace the sorrow. It wasn't the fiery, explosive anger of youth. It was a deep, quiet, structural anger. The anger of a master builder who sees the foundation he laid with integrity being undermined by rot and decay, and a builder knows what must be done when the structure is compromised. You don't just patch the cracks. You go back to the foundation, you expose the weakness, and you rebuild, stronger and truer than before. They thought they had finished my story. They thought they had written the final chapter, but they had forgotten one thing. I was the author, and I was about to write a new ending. Martha had a saying. "A man who builds with his hands," she used to tell me, "knows the value of a solid foundation. But a man who builds with his heart knows where the load-bearing walls are." For years, I thought she was talking about houses. That night, I finally understood. She was talking about family. I had been the foundation, taken for granted, hidden underground. But I was also the load-bearing wall holding their entire facade upright, and they had no idea. My quiet compliance had become their greatest asset, my unconditional love, their most reliable line of credit, my silence, their permission to continue. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my generosity for foolishness. That was about to change. My plan wouldn't be born of anger, but of engineering. I was a builder, after all. I knew how to read blueprints, and I was about to read theirs. The next morning, I didn't reach for the phone to confront Mark. Confrontation was his arena, a place of excuses, deflections, and gaslighting. My arena was quieter. It was the world of contracts, bylaws, and the beautiful, immutable certainty of the written word. I drove downtown, not to the gleaming glass tower that now housed the rebranded Grayson Legacy Homes, but to a dusty, unassuming office in the old city archives. I spent 4 hours there, breathing in the scent of aging paper, my hands tracing the lines of documents I hadn't looked at in decades. I was searching for the original blueprints of my life's work, and I found them, the company charter, the foundational document. In our modern world of digital contracts and fleeting agreements, they had forgotten about the power of ink on paper. There, in Section 4, Clause B, was a provision Martha had insisted upon, a legacy clause, she called it. It stated that as the founder, I retained permanent veto power over any sale or significant leveraging of the company's core assets, specifically the land bank, parcels of prime real estate I had acquired over 40 years. This power was non-transferable and required my physical signature in person, witnessed by a notary. A slow smile spread across my face for the first time in what felt like an eternity. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a chess master, who realizes his opponent has just moved their queen into the perfect trap. You see, I knew something Mark and Jessica didn't. Their entire next-generation expansion plan, the one they had used to justify their lavish spending and my exclusion, was built on one single massive project, the Grayson Pinnacle. It was a luxury high-rise condominium complex, Jessica's pet project, designed to be the glittering jewel in their new corporate crown. It was ambitious, flashy, and incredibly risky, and it was set to be built on the single most valuable piece of land the company owned, a plot overlooking the river that I had bought for a pittance 30 years ago. To fund it, they would need to mortgage that land to the hilt, an act that fell directly under the purview of Section 4, Clause B. They needed my signature. Their arrogance was their fatal flaw. They had been so busy rebranding the company's future that they never bothered to read its past. They saw me as a ghost, a relic. They never imagined the ghost had written the very laws of the kingdom they were trying to rule. Armed with this knowledge, my next stop was to an old friend. Not a lawyer. Not yet. I went to see Arthur Vance, my first ever accountant. Arthur was retired now, a sharp, cantankerous man who spent his days doing complex crossword puzzles and distrusting anyone under the age of 60. He was also the most honest man I knew. I laid it all out for him. The party, the texts, the constant drain on my personal finances. I showed him the company charter. He listened without interruption, his gaze sharp and analytical. When I finished, he took a slow sip of his tea. "David," he said, his voice raspy but firm, "you've been a father for 40 years. It's time to be a founder again. These children," he scoffed, "they think a balance sheet is a suggestion. They don't understand that numbers have a memory. And your numbers tell a story of exploitation." "I don't want to destroy the company, Arthur," I said, the words heavy in my mouth. "It's Martha's legacy, too." Martha's legacy wasn't about glass. "Towers!" Arthur shot back, tapping the charter with a gnarled finger. "It was about integrity. Protecting that legacy is your duty. So, what's the plan? A hostile takeover of your own company?" "Something quieter," I replied. "I'm going to let them build their beautiful, glittering trap. I'm going to watch them sign the contracts, shake the hands, and pop the champagne. I'm going to let them walk, right up to the edge of the cliff. And just when they are about to take that final, triumphant leap, I'm going to remind them who owns the ground beneath their feet." Arthur's eyes twinkled for the first time. "Poetic justice," he murmured. "I like it. What do you need from me?" "I need a ghost," I said. "A ghost in their accounting system. I need you to set up a series of quiet alerts for me. I want to know every time a major invoice for the Pinnacle project is paid. Every time they draw from the corporate line of credit. I want to see the exact moment they commit everything they have to this project." Arthur grinned, a rare and fearsome sight. "Consider it done. They won't see a thing. Ghosts are my specialty." I left Arthur's house that day feeling a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was now overlaid with a cold, clear purpose. I was no longer a victim of their narrative. I was becoming the silent, unseen editor of their downfall. The final piece of my plan fell into place that evening, and it came from the most unexpected source. An email from my granddaughter, Sarah. Unlike the curt texts from her parents, her email was long and thoughtful. She was writing a school paper on everyday heroes, and she had chosen me. "Grandpa," she wrote, "I hope you don't mind, but I'm writing about you. I was telling my friends about how you started the company with nothing and how you built our house. I remember you teaching me how to use a hammer, even though Mom said I'd hurt myself. You always believed I could do things. I found some of your old business journals in the attic, the ones from the early days. Your handwriting is so neat, it feels like reading a piece of history. I'm really proud to be your granddaughter." Her words were a balm to my wounded soul. But it was the mention of the journals that sparked the final idea. Those journals, they didn't just contain financial records, they contained stories, promises made and kept, handshake deals honored, personal loans I had given to employees who had fallen on hard times, loans that were quietly paid back with loyalty and hard work. They contained the very soul of the company, the traditional style Mark and Jessica were so eager to erase. The journals were the heart, the charter was the law, and their arrogance was the noose. All the pieces were now in place. I wouldn't need to raise my voice. I wouldn't need to fight. I would simply let them continue on their path, oblivious. And when the time was right, I would use the two things they disdained the most, history and the law, to remind them what a legacy truly means. The next generation was about to get a lesson from the one that came before. And class was about to be in session. Patience is a weapon the arrogant never see coming. While they were busy, building their monument of glass and steel, I was quietly reinforcing my foundations. My life became a study in contrasts. Theirs was a flurry of press releases and groundbreaking ceremonies. Mine was a return to the simple, tangible truths I had forgotten. I started working in my woodshop again, the scent of fresh-cut pine a welcome antidote to the sterile scent of their ambition. The grain of the wood beneath my hands was real. It didn't lie. It didn't rebrand itself. It was what it was. And there was a profound comfort in that. Arthur and I met every Tuesday. He'd slide a plain manila envelope across the coffee shop table, no words exchanged. Inside were the reports. The Pinnacle project was moving at a breakneck pace, and so was their spending. They had secured a massive preliminary loan, leveraging the company's existing assets. Assets they didn't realize they didn't have the final authority to pledge. They were signing contracts with international suppliers, paying exorbitant fees for consultants who were little more than Jessica's well-connected friends. They were bleeding the company's cash reserves dry, betting everything on this one. Spectacular roll of the dice. Each report was a nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. I filed them away in a new, locked cabinet in my study. The evidence grew, a silent, damning testament to their hubris. I felt no joy in watching them march towards the cliff. Instead, I felt a deep, resonant sorrow. I was watching my son gamble away not just a company, but his own integrity, and he was completely blind to the cost. My only real connection to their world was through Sarah. Her emails were a lifeline. She wrote about her struggles with chemistry, her excitement about joining the debate team, and occasionally she would mention things at home. Her words painted a picture of a house filled with tension. "Mom and Dad are stressed a lot," she wrote in one email. "The Pinnacle project is all they talk about. Mom has blueprints covering the entire dining room table, and Dad is always on the phone. Sometimes I hear them arguing late at night. Dad said something about cash flow, and Mom told him not to be so negative. Negative. That was Jessica's word for reality. She was living in a future of her own design, and any fact that contradicted her vision was dismissed as negativity. The calls from Mark stopped completely. There were no more texts asking for money. They didn't need my personal funds anymore. They had the entire company's treasury at their disposal. They believed they had outgrown me. I had become, in their minds, completely irrelevant. And that was exactly where I needed to be. In the blind spot of their arrogance, the thing of value that would trigger the turning point wasn't something they could buy or sell. It was something far more precious. It was Martha's memory. Every year on the anniversary of her passing, I hosted a small, private dinner. It was never a sad occasion. It was a celebration of her life. I would invite the old guard, the handful of employees who had been with us from the beginning, who remembered Martha not as a name on a scholarship fund, but as the woman who brought hot coffee to the construction site on cold mornings. We would share stories, laugh, and remember the heart of the company she had helped build. This year, I sent the invitations as usual. A simple, handwritten card. I even sent one to Mark and Jessica's house, addressed to the whole family. I didn't expect them to come, but it felt like the right thing to do. A part of me, the stubborn, hopeful part, thought that maybe, just maybe, they would remember what day it was. The evening of the dinner arrived. My house was filled with the warm, familiar faces of old friends. Arthur was there, as was my lead. Carpenter, a man named Sal, who could tell stories that would make you cry with laughter. We raised a glass to Martha. We talked about the old days. For a few hours, the weight of the past few months lifted. I felt like myself again. Around 8 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. It was a photo. The photo was of Mark and Jessica at a lavish restaurant. They were clinking champagne glasses, beaming at the camera. Behind them, a banner was visible. It read, "Celebrating the Grayson Pinnacle, topping off party." They were at a corporate event, a party to celebrate pouring the final floor of their new building. They hadn't just forgotten the anniversary of Martha's passing. They had scheduled a celebration for their own ambition on the very same night. My hand tightened around my phone. Sal, seeing my face, put a hand on my shoulder. "Everything all right, David?" I couldn't speak. I just showed him the photo. A hush fell over the small group as the phone was passed from hand to hand. The quiet camaraderie of our dinner was shattered, replaced by a collective unspoken understanding. This wasn't just an oversight, this was a desecration. Arthur looked at me, his eyes hard as flint. "The soulless bastards," he whispered, a rare curse from a man who measured his words carefully. But that wasn't the worst of it. A few minutes later, another message arrived, this time from Sarah. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry." I told them what tonight was. I reminded Dad this morning. He said business couldn't wait. Mom said we needed to prioritize the future, not the past. I wanted to be with you. They wouldn't let me. They said I had to be there for the photographers. I'm so sorry. I love you. I read the message, and the cold anger I had been nursing for months finally ignited into a white-hot flame. This was no longer just about a company. This was about my wife's memory. This was about my granddaughter being used as a prop in their shallow, self-serving drama. They hadn't just forgotten Martha. They were actively erasing her, prioritizing their concrete and glass future over the flesh and blood past that had given them everything. They had crossed a line. A sacred line. They had taken the one thing I held most precious, the memory of the woman I loved, and deemed it irrelevant, an obstacle to their brand. They had weaponized my granddaughter's loyalty. That was the turning point. The moment. The engineer in my head was silenced by the husband and grandfather in my heart. The plan I had so carefully constructed was no longer just about justice. It was about reclamation. I wasn't just going to take back my company. I was going to take back my family's soul from the people who had tried to sell it for a better view. I stood up, my hands steady. My friends looked at me, their faces etched with concern. "David?" Arthur asked. I looked around the room at the faces of the people who remembered, who cared. "The future," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm, "is about to meet the past, and the past is not in a forgiving mood." I walked into my study and picked up the phone. It was time to call my lawyer. The quiet part was over. Sleep did not visit me that night. Instead, I sat in the dark, Martha's portrait illuminated by a single lamp, and I let the rage burn. It wasn't a destructive fire, but a clarifying one. It burned away the last vestiges of hope I had for the son I once knew. It incinerated the excuses I had made. By the time the sun rose, all that was left was the cold, hard certainty of what I had to do. My grief had finally been honed into a tool. I was in Eleanor Vance's office at 8 a.m. sharp. Eleanor was not a friend like Arthur. She was a weapon. She was the best corporate litigator in the city, a woman known for her surgical precision and a complete lack of sentimentality. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I needed a shark. They used a corporate event to desecrate my wife's memory, I said, my voice devoid of emotion as I finished my story. They used my granddaughter as a prop for their public relations. This is no longer a business dispute, Eleanor. This is a moral failure of the highest order. I am done being quiet. I want to activate Section 4, Clause B, and I want to do it in the most public and undeniable way possible. Eleanor listened, her fingers steepled. She reviewed the documents Arthur had compiled, the lavish expenses, the questionable contracts. Then she looked at the company charter, her eyes lingering on the legacy clause. The language is ironclad. David, she said, a flicker of professional admiration in her eyes. Your veto power is absolute. The financing for the Pinnacle project cannot proceed without your signature. You hold the kill switch. I don't just want to kill it, I replied, leaning forward. I want to make a statement. I want every investor, every contractor, every city official they've schmoozed to understand what Grayson Legacy Homes truly stands for, and what it does not. Eleanor's lips curved into a thin, predatory smile. Then we won't send a letter. We'll set a meeting. A mandatory, all-hands-on-deck shareholder and primary investor meeting. We'll put them all in one room. Your son, your daughter-in-law, the bankers, the investors, and you will deliver your decision in person. They won't come, I said. Mark will just call it another attempt by the old guard to stall progress. Oh, they'll come, Eleanor said, already typing an email. The official summons will be from my office, citing a material fiduciary risk to the Pinnacle project that requires immediate clarification from the company's majority shareholder. The bankers will be there before the coffee is even brewed. Their money is on the line. Mark and Jessica will have no choice but to attend, if only to save face. The meeting was set for Friday. 3 days. It felt like a lifetime, and no time at all. While Eleanor handled the legal machinations, I focused on a different, more symbolic part of my plan. The attack on Martha's memory demanded a response in kind. Her legacy wasn't just a clause in a charter. It was in the hearts of the people she'd touched, in the community she'd loved. I was going to remind the city and my son of that legacy. I spent the next 2 days on the phone, not with lawyers, but with the recipients of the Martha Grayson Community Scholarship Fund, a charity I had been quietly funding for years. It provided grants to vocational schools for aspiring craftsmen, carpenters, electricians, masons, the very people my son and daughter-in-law had deemed irrelevant. I spoke to a young woman who was now a master plumber, a single father who had become a sought-after welder, a young man who had started his own small landscaping business. I told them my story. I didn't ask for much. Just one thing. Would you be willing to share what this scholarship, what Martha's legacy, meant to you? The final piece of my plan involved the one thing Jessica valued above all else: public perception. She had hired a top-tier PR firm to handle the launch of the Pinnacle, a firm run by a woman named Cassandra Thorne, who was known for her ruthless efficiency and her love of a good story. I managed to get a meeting with her not as David Grayson, the forgotten founder, but as a concerned citizen and philanthropist. I didn't tell her about the internal power struggle. I didn't mention the veto. Instead, I told her a story. I told her about a company built on the values of quality and integrity. I told her about a woman named Martha who believed in community. And then I told her about a new luxury high-rise being built on land that was once earmarked for a community park, a project that was erasing the very history of the company building it. The current leadership is very next generation, I said, using their own word against them. They're focused on the optics of luxury, on attracting a certain kind of clientele. I just think it's a shame that the real story of this company, the story of hard work, community, and giving back, is being lost. It's a powerful story, a human story, the kind of story that people connect with on a deeper level than shiny glass and steel. I could see the wheels turning in her head. A PR maven like Cassandra Thorne didn't get to the top by ignoring a compelling narrative. The story of the forgotten founder, the heart and soul of a company being pushed aside by slick corporate modernizers. It was a PR nightmare for her clients and a potential goldmine for a rival. I'm also the primary benefactor of the Martha Grayson Scholarship Fund, I added casually, sliding a folder across the table. We're announcing our largest ever round of grants next week. We have some incredibly moving stories from the recipients. I was thinking of holding a small press conference. I didn't need to say more. I had given her a choice. She could either be blindsided by a story that painted her clients as heartless gentrifiers who desecrated the memory of the founder's wife, or she could get ahead of it. I had planted a seed of doubt. A narrative bomb set to detonate at the exact moment of their greatest vulnerability. I walked out of her office knowing I had turned their greatest weapon, their obsession with public image, against them. They were so focused on crafting the perfect story that they never considered someone else might be a better storyteller. The day before the big meeting, I did one last thing. I went to the attic and retrieved the journals Sarah had mentioned. I spent the evening rereading my own history, Martha's neat notes in the margins, the dreams and struggles of a young man trying to build something that would last. I found the entry from the day Mark was born. Held my son for the first time today, I had written. He has Martha's eyes. I swear I will spend the rest of my life building a world worthy of him. A single tear fell onto the page, smudging the 40-year-old ink. The world I had built was worthy. The question was he? I closed the journal and placed it in my briefcase. I was ready. My rage had cooled, forged into a purpose as strong and unyielding as steel. Friday was no longer about stopping a project. It was about a father reminding his son what it truly means to build a legacy. It's not about how high you can build, but about how deep your foundations run. And their foundations were about to be exposed as nothing but sand. There is a clarity that comes before a storm. The air grows still, the world holds its breath. On the morning of the meeting, I didn't feel anxious. I felt centered. Sharpening my father's old chisels was a ritual, a way of connecting to the generations of Grayson men who understood a simple truth. Before you can build, you must have a sharp edge. My edge was no longer dulled by grief or clouded by hope. It was honed by truth. My phone remained silent. Mark hadn't called. Jessica hadn't texted. Eleanor's legal summons had rendered them speechless, forced into a corner they didn't know existed. Their usual tactics, deflection, dismissal, charm, were useless against the cold, hard language of a legal document. They were being compelled to face the one thing they had spent years avoiding: accountability. I thought about what they must be doing. I pictured them in their pristine, minimalist home, the one my traditional money had paid for. Jessica would be furious, her anger a frantic, buzzing energy. She would be blaming Mark for not handling me sooner. She would be on the phone with her own lawyers, searching for a loophole, a weakness, a way to spin this to their advantage. She would see this as an attack on her brand, her vision. Mark, on the other hand, would be adrift in a sea of his own making. He would feel the prickle of old loyalty, a ghost of the boy he used to be, warring with the fear of his wife's disapproval and the terror of losing the empire he felt he was entitled to. He wouldn't see this as an attack, but as a problem to be managed. He would be preparing a speech, crafting a narrative of misunderstanding, of a generational gap. He would try to appeal to me as a son, hoping to leverage a relationship he had long since neglected. They were both wrong. This wasn't an attack, and it wasn't a problem to be managed. It was a reckoning. At 10 a.m., I received a call from an unknown number. I answered. "Mr. Grayson?" The voice was smooth, professional. "This is Cassandra Thorne." The PR maven. My seed had sprouted faster than I expected. I've been doing some due diligence following our conversation, she said, her tone all business. And I've come across some interesting public records, specifically the original charter of Grayson Legacy Homes. My legal team finds Section 4, Clause B, to be of particular interest. I imagine they would, I said calmly. There was a pause. There is a significant shareholder meeting today, I believe, one that my firm was not made aware of by your son's office. This feels like a material omission, a breach of transparency that could have significant brand repercussions. Transparency is very important, I agreed. Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice lowering slightly, my firm's reputation is built on managing narratives, not being surprised by them. A story about a son pushing out his venerable founder and attempting to leverage the company's assets against its own charter, all while publicly disrespecting the memory of his deceased mother. That's not a narrative I can spin. That's a brand apocalypse. I see, I said. What I'm offering, she continued, is a chance to control the fallout. My loyalty is to my client, but my professional survival depends on not being attached to a sinking ship. If a change in leadership is imminent, perhaps the new leadership would be interested in a PR strategy that emphasizes a return to core values. The shark had smelled blood in the water. She was offering to switch sides. Thank you for the call, Miss Thorne, I said, giving nothing away. I will certainly keep that in mind. I hung up, a grim satisfaction settling over me. The cracks were already showing in their perfect facade. Their own weapon, their obsession with image, was turning on them. My final preparation was a quiet one. I drove to the cemetery. The sky was a crisp, clear blue. I stood before Martha's headstone, its simple inscription, Martha Grayson, a life built with love, a quiet rebuke to the world my son had created. I placed a small bouquet of fresh cut, rosemary from my garden at its base, the same rosemary I had used in the casserole that had been left to grow cold on their doorstep. I'm sorry, my love, I whispered to the quiet stone. I'm sorry I let it get this far. I was so afraid of losing him that I didn't realize I already had. But I'm going to fix it. I'm going to protect what we built. Not the company, not the money, the idea of it, the integrity. I hope you'd be proud. As I stood there, a profound sense of peace washed over me. The rage was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. This wasn't for me. It was for her. It was for the boy my son used to be. It was for the granddaughter who still saw the man I was. On the drive to the meeting, I didn't listen to the news. I put on an old Sinatra album, the one Martha and I used, to dance to in the living room after a long week. His voice, smooth and confident, filled the car. I did it my way. I arrived at the Grayson Legacy Homes Tower and parked, not in the executive garage, but in the visitor's lot. I walked through the front doors, the same doors I had walked through for 40 years. The young receptionist didn't recognize me. She asked who I was there to see. I'm here for the shareholder meeting, I said, my voice even. Name? She asked, looking at her tablet. Grayson, I said. David Grayson. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked up, a flicker of recognition, of confusion. She saw a man in a flannel shirt, not the titan of industry from the old photos. I was the ghost she'd heard whispers about. Of course, Mr. Grayson, she stammered. They're in the main conference room, top floor. As I rode the silent high-speed elevator, I looked at my reflection in the polished steel walls. The man looking back at me was older, his face etched with lines of grief and worry, but his eyes were clear. For the first time in a long time, they held no doubt. The elevator doors opened onto a plush, silent corridor. At the end of the hall were the double doors of the main conference room. I could hear the low murmur of voices from within. They were all in there, The bankers with their nervous money, the investors with their hopeful greed, and my son sitting at the head of the table he hadn't earned, in a chair he didn't own. I took a deep breath. I thought of Martha. I thought of the legacy clause. I thought of the cold, hard truth contained in my briefcase. This wasn't an execution. It was a course correction. It was a father, a founder, and a husband coming to reclaim his house. I reached for the handle, the cold brass a shock against my warm skin, and I pushed the door open. The turning point was over. It was time for the fall. The silence in that room was a physical thing. It was heavier than stone. Every eye was on me, a man in a simple flannel shirt standing in the doorway of a world that had declared him obsolete. I saw a range of emotions on their faces. Confusion from the investors, polite curiosity from the bankers, and from my son and daughter-in-law, a flash of pure, unadulterated shock, quickly masked by annoyance. They looked at me as if I were a janitor who had wandered into the wrong room. I didn't say a word. I simply walked forward, my work boots making a soft, steady rhythm on the plush carpet. It was the sound of my history reclaiming its space. I walked past the investors, past the bankers, and I didn't stop until I reached the head of the table. I placed my old leather briefcase on the gleaming surface with a soft thud that echoed in the silence. Mark was the first to recover. He stood up, forcing a smile that was all teeth. It was his CEO smile, the one he used to placate difficult clients. "Dad," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too jovial. "This is a surprise. We weren't expecting you. As you can see, we're in a very important meeting regarding the future of the company." "I know," I said, my voice calm and even. It held none of the tremor they expected, none of the anger they were prepared to dismiss. "That's why I'm here. I believe, as the majority shareholder, my presence is not just expected. It's required, the T." Term majority shareholder hung in the air. I saw the bankers exchange a quick, nervous glance. Jessica's smirk tightened into a thin, hard line. "David," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "with all due respect, your shares are a formality at this point. Mark is the CEO. He has the board's full confidence. We're discussing the final financing phase for the Pinnacle. This is really above your level of day-to-day involvement now." "My involvement," I said, meeting her cold gaze without flinching, "is foundational. And today, we're going to have a frank discussion about foundations." I pulled a single folded document from my briefcase and placed it on the table. It was a copy of the original company charter. "I believe you all received a summons from my legal counsel, Ms. Eleanor Vance," I said, my eyes sweeping across the room. "The summons mentioned a material fiduciary risk. That risk is sitting right here at this table." Mark's face paled. He knew what was coming. "Dad, this isn't the time or the place." "On the contrary, Mark," I interrupted, my voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge of steel. "This is precisely the time and the place. Before we discuss the future, we must acknowledge the past. This company, Grayson Legacy Homes, was built on a set of principles. Principles of quality, integrity, and honor. Principles outlined in this charter, the very document that gives you the authority to sit in that chair." I let my words sink in. The investors were leaning forward now, their curiosity piqued. The Pinnacle project, as ambitious as it is, represents a departure from those principles, I continued. It represents a gamble, a massive leveraging of this company's assets on a high-risk venture. A venture that requires, for its final funding, the mortgaging of the company's most valuable landholding, the Riverbend. The lead banker, a man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "Mr. Grayson, your son and his team have presented us with a very compelling projection. The ROI on the Pinnacle is—" "The ROI is irrelevant," I said, cutting him off cleanly. "Because The projection is based on a false premise, the premise that the CEO has the authority to authorize such a transaction. I looked directly at Mark. His face was a mask of controlled panic. Jessica placed a restraining hand on his arm, her eyes, flashing a warning. "And he does," Jessica said, her voice sharp. "As CEO, Mark has full operational authority. He has the authority you've allowed him to believe he has," I corrected gently. "But you seem to have forgotten the fine print. Or perhaps," I added, my gaze locking onto hers, "you simply never bothered to read it." I opened my briefcase again and took out a stack of bound journals, my old business logs. I placed them on the table next to the charter. "These journals contain the history of this company," I said, addressing the whole room. "They contain the handshake deals, the promises kept, the stories of the men and women who built this company with their sweat and their loyalty. They are the soul of Grayson Legacy Homes." Then I picked up the charter. "And this," I said, holding it up, "is its law." I opened it to the bookmarked page. "I'd like to draw everyone's attention to Section 4, Clause B, the Legacy Clause. Allow me to read it aloud." My voice filled the silent room, clear and steady. "As founder, David Grayson retains permanent and non-transferable veto power over any sale, lease, or leveraging of the company's core real estate assets as defined in Appendix A. Such an action requires the founder's physical, notarized signature. Any attempt to bypass this clause renders the transaction null and void." A collective intake of breath could be heard around the table. Henderson, the banker, snatched a copy of the prospectus in front of him, flipping furiously through the pages. "This is ridiculous," Jessica hissed, her composure finally cracking. "It's an archaic clause. It's meaningless in a modern corporate structure." "Tell that to the State Bar, Ms. Grayson," I said coolly. "Because my lawyer, Ms. Vance, seems to think it's the most meaningful clause in the entire document." "Mr. Henderson," I said, turning to the banker, "has my son presented you with a document bearing my notarized signature authorizing the leveraging of the Riverbend property?" Henderson looked from me to Mark, his face turning a shade of angry red. "No," he said, his voice tight. "We were operating under the assumption that the CEO's authority was sufficient." "A dangerous assumption," I said, "one that has placed your institution at considerable risk. Because I am here today to state, for the record, that I, David Grayson, as the majority shareholder and the sole authority on this matter, will not be signing. I am exercising my veto." The words landed like a death blow. "The project was dead. You can't do that." Mark finally exploded, finding his voice. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This project is the future. It's worth hundreds of millions. You'll bankrupt the company out of spite." "Spite?" I asked, and for the first time, a flicker of my deep, cold anger showed. "Let me tell you about spite, son. Spite is scheduling a topping-off party on the anniversary of your mother's death. Spite is telling your own father he's not welcome at a celebration because his style is uncomfortable. Spite is using your daughter as a prop for photographers while ignoring the woman whose memory gave you this life." Every word was a perfectly aimed shot. The investors recoiled. Jessica's face went white. Mark looked as if I had physically struck him. "This isn't about spite," I said, my voice dropping back to its calm, controlled level. "This is about integrity. You have leveraged this company to the breaking point. You have drained its cash reserves. You have tarnished its reputation for quality. And you have done so with a level of arrogance and disrespect that I will no longer tolerate." I paused, letting the weight of my accusation settle. "The Pinnacle project is canceled, effective immediately. And that," I said, looking directly at my son, "is just the beginning." In that moment, I saw my son not as a CEO, but as a boy who had been given a kingdom and had tried to pawn the crown jewels to fund a party. His anger wasn't the righteous fury of a leader whose vision was challenged. It was the petulant rage of a child whose favorite toy had just been taken away. He had forgotten the first rule of power. You can only wield what you truly understand. And he had never understood the source of his. "This is insane," Jessica finally managed to say, her voice a low, trembling hiss. She turned to the investors, attempting to regain control of the room. "Gentlemen, this is a family squabble, a personal vendetta. My father-in-law is clearly not in a stable state of mind. He's emotional. He's trying to sabotage the company because he feels left behind. It was a predictable move. The classic, 'he's old and confused' defense. But I was prepared for it." "Emotional?" I repeated, my voice calm. "Miss Grayson, my decisions today are based on data, not drama, which brings me to my next point." I turned to my briefcase and pulled out another, much thicker file. I slid it to the center of the obsidian table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. The label on the file was simple: Internal Audit, Q2, Q4. "While you were busy planning parties and rebranding," I said, addressing Mark and Jessica directly, "I authorized a quiet internal audit, conducted by Mr. Arthur Vance, the company's original and most trusted accountant." At the mention of Arthur's name, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in Mark's eyes. He knew Arthur. He knew his reputation for merciless accuracy. "I won't bore the entire room with the details," I said, opening the file. "But I will provide a summary for our investors and financial partners, who I'm sure will be very interested. Let's start with the consulting fees for the Pinnacle project. Over $2 million paid to J Designs, Inc., a company which, after a little digging, we found to be a shell corporation registered to a Ms. Jennifer Swanson." I paused, then looked directly at Jessica. "That's your maiden name, isn't it?" The color drained from her face. The investors gasped. Henderson, the banker, looked like he was going to be physically ill. "It seems you've been paying yourself a handsome finder's fee with company money?" I continued, my tone matter of fact. "And then there are the construction material contracts. You canceled our long-standing agreements with local high-quality suppliers in favor of an overseas conglomerate, Apex Global Materials. You claimed it was for cost savings. However, our audit reveals that Apex is owned by a holding company, which is, in turn, a primary investor in your brother's tech startup. You weren't saving money, Jessica. You were enriching your family." I flipped a page. "And Mark, while your wife was busy with her creative accounting, you were hardly a model of fiscal responsibility. This audit details over $300,000 in unspecified corporate expenses over the last 6 months. These include a family ski trip to Aspen, a lease on a new Porsche, and, my personal favorite, a $5,000 charge for vintage champagne at a certain topping off-party last Saturday." I let the words hang there. The air was thick with the stench of their deceit. They hadn't just been arrogant, they had been criminals, using the company I built as their personal piggy bank. These are baseless accusations," Jessica stammered, but the conviction had vanished from her voice. She was cornered. "Are they?" I asked. I reached into the file one last time and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Because these are the bank statements, the wire transfers, and the sworn affidavit from the contracts department detailing the pressure you put on them to approve the Apex deal. The evidence is not baseless, Ms. Grayson. It is overwhelming." I pushed the stack of papers towards Henderson. He took them with a trembling hand, his eyes scanning the top page. His face went from red to ashen gray. "Now," I said, reclaiming control of the room. "Given these developments, I am exercising not only my rights as majority shareholder, but my duty as the chairman of this board. A board which, I might add, has been derelict in its oversight duties." I looked around at the other board members, who were now staring at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. As of this moment, Mark Grayson is terminated as CEO of Grayson Legacy Homes for cause. His corporate accounts are frozen, his access to all company property is revoked, and a legal team will be in touch regarding the potential clawback of all misappropriated funds. Mark sank back into his chair as if his legs had given out. He looked utterly defeated. Furthermore, I said, my gaze shifting to Jessica, a formal investigation will be launched into the fraudulent activities surrounding J Designs Inc. and the Apex Global Materials contract. I trust the authorities will be very interested in your definition of consulting. Jessica shot up from her chair. You wouldn't dare, she seethed, her voice a venomous whisper. He's your son. You'll destroy your own family to get what you want. My family? I asked, and the quiet pain in my voice momentarily silenced her. My family is a memory of a woman who believed in honor. My family is a granddaughter who still knows right from wrong. What you and my son have become, that is not my family. That is a liability. And I said, my voice hardening again, am a builder. I do not tolerate structural weaknesses. I stood up, my own chair making a quiet, authoritative sound. This meeting is adjourned. Mr. Henderson, and to our esteemed investors, my office will be in touch within 24 hours with a stabilization and recovery plan. I will be resuming the role of interim CEO effective immediately. We will be returning to the principles that made this company great: quality, integrity, and fiscal responsibility. We will weather this storm, and we will emerge stronger, my A. Words were a promise, a declaration of intent. I was not just cleaning house. I was rebuilding it. I turned to leave, my briefcase now feeling significantly lighter. I had laid out the facts. I had executed the plan. I had delivered the consequences. But as I reached the door, Mark's voice, small and broken, called out, Dad, wait. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see the ruin I had wrought on his face, even if it was a ruin of his own making. What is it, Mark? I asked, my voice tired. The house, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What about the house? We'll be ruined. The house. Even in the smoldering wreckage of his career and his wife's potential criminal indictment, his first thought was the house. The symbol of the life he felt he was owed. The life I had funded. A cold, hard finality settled in my heart. The boy I had raised was truly gone, replaced by this man who measured his life in square footage and property values. I took a breath. That, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation, is a separate conversation, and it's one we will have on my terms, not yours. I opened the door and walked out, leaving them to sit in the deafening silence of their collapsed empire. Walking away from that room was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There is no joy in dismantling your own son's life, even when he has left you no other choice. Every instinct in my body, the paternal instincts honed over a lifetime, screamed at me to go back, to comfort him, to find a softer way. But the founder in me, the man Martha had believed in, knew that some breaks are too severe for a simple bandage. The entire structure had to be torn down to the studs before anything new and true could ever hope to be built again. Their concern about the house echoed in my mind. It was the final, heartbreaking confirmation of their priorities. Not remorse, not shame, but fear of losing their lifestyle. The house was more than a home to them. It was a stage, a beautifully appointed backdrop for the perfect life they performed, for the world. And I was the silent, invisible stagehand who had paid for it all. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the one place that felt like a sanctuary, the community workshop, a place I had helped fund years ago, a place filled with the honest scent of sawdust and the sound of creation. I spent the rest of the afternoon there, not building anything, just sitting, watching young craftsmen at work, their faces alight with the passion of making something real with their own hands. It reminded me of a time when Mark's face held that same light. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the workshop floor, I knew what the final step had to be. It couldn't just be about the company. The initial wound, the one that had started this all, was personal. It was about being told I was not welcome. It was about being made to feel like a stranger in a world I had built. The resolution had to be equally personal. That evening, I did not call Mark. I did not text him. I drove to their house. The house. I parked across the street, just as I had on the night of the party, and I watched. The lights were on, but there was no celebratory glow. It was the harsh, sterile light of a crisis. I could see their silhouettes moving frantically behind the curtains. I didn't go to the door. I didn't need to. I had something better. I pulled out my phone and called a number I had programmed earlier that day. "This is David Grayson," I said, when a man answered. "Is the team ready?" "Ready and waiting for your signal, Mr. Grayson," the man replied. "Proceed," I said, and hung up. A few moments later, a large, unmarked flatbed truck pulled up in front of their house. On its bed was a small, beautifully constructed modular home, a tiny house, as they're called now. It was a perfect miniature of the first house I had ever built, the one Martha and I had started our lives in, complete with a small porch and a window box. Following the truck was a small crew of my most trusted old guard employees, led by my carpenter, Sal. They worked with quiet, practiced efficiency under the glow of the streetlights. They were not demolition experts. They were builders. With a small crane, they lifted the tiny house off the truck and gently, precisely, placed it directly in the middle of the perfectly manicured front lawn. The lawn I had paid for. Then, they began to build a simple, elegant fence around it. Not a spite fence. A property line. They were delineating my space from theirs, right in the heart of their territory. As they worked, I saw the front door of the main house fly open. Mark and Jessica stormed out onto their porch, their faces contorted, with disbelief and outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" Jessica shrieked, her voice echoing in the quiet suburban street. "What are you doing? Get off our property!" Sal, a man who had more integrity in his calloused little finger than she had in her entire body, simply tipped his hat. "Evening, ma'am," he said calmly. "We're not on your property. We're on Mr. Grayson's property. We're just making a few improvements." I finally got out of my car and walked across the street. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I stopped at the edge of the lawn just outside the new unfinished fence line. "This is insane, Dad," Mark yelled, his voice cracking. "You've lost your mind. You can't just put another house in our front yard." "Why not?" I asked, my voice carrying easily in the still night air. "I own the land, and according to my deed, there are no covenants that prevent the construction of a secondary residence." I looked past him, at the grand, imposing house behind them. "You've made it clear that I am not welcome in your house," I said, my voice steady. "You've made me feel like an outsider, an inconvenience, so I decided to accept that. I'm no longer asking for a seat at your table. I've decided to build my own." I gestured to the small, perfect house now sitting on their lawn. "This is my residence now when I choose to be here. My own front door, my own space, on my own land." "You're doing this to humiliate us," Jessica screamed, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. "The neighbors. What will people think?" "Ah, the neighbors," I said, a sad smile touching my lips. "You've been so worried about what they think, but you never once worried about what I think. You see, Jessica, you wanted a next-generation event. You wanted a brand that looked to the future, not the past. Well, congratulations. You've got it. Your house represents your future, a future built on debt, deceit, and a foundation of sand. And my house," I said, patting a newly placed fence post, represents my past. A past built on solid ground, with honest materials, and a door that is always open to those who know the meaning of respect. I looked at my son. His face was a wreck of conflicting emotions. The anger was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrifying understanding. He wasn't just losing a company. He was losing his home, not in a literal sense, but in a spiritual one. I had reclaimed the moral high ground, and I had done it by planting my flag, a small, humble, honest house, right in the middle of his ill-gotten kingdom. Every morning, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, when you wake up in your big, beautiful house, you will look out your window and you will see this. You will see a reminder of where you came from. You will see the legacy you discarded. You will see the man you erased. I'm not locking you out, son. I'm just making sure you can never again forget that I am here. I turned my back on them then. The fence was almost complete. Sal and his crew were installing a small, simple gate. My house. On my land. They thought my power was in my money, in the shares I held, in the company I owned. They were wrong. My real power, the power they had forgotten, was the power of a builder. I knew how to create things from nothing. They only knew how to occupy spaces built by others. That night, I didn't take their house away from them. I simply took back the land it stood on, not legally, but morally. I had built a new foundation, a visible one, a constant, undeniable reminder of the truth. They could live in their castle, but they would do so in the shadow of the humble cottage that had paid for it all. The ghost had returned. And this time, he wasn't going to be ignored. The aftermath of a storm is always quieter than the storm itself. In the weeks that followed, the loud, frantic anger from Mark and Jessica was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. They didn't try to have the cottage removed. Their lawyers, no doubt, informed them they had no legal grounds to do so. They were trapped, forced to live with a constant physical reminder of their transgressions. The story, as I knew it would, spread through our small, affluent community not like a wildfire but like a slow-moving fog. There were no public accusations, just whispers. The tale of the forgotten founder and the house on the lawn became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at country club bars and charity luncheons. Jessica's carefully curated social standing crumbled. The invitations to galas and exclusive events dried up. Her brand, the one she had been so desperate to build, was now irrevocably tainted by a story she couldn't control, the story of a woman who had locked her father-in-law out in the cold. She had become, in a cruel twist of irony, uncomfortable to be around. They put up tall hedges, a desperate attempt to hide the cottage from view, but it was useless. You can't hide a symbol. The cottage wasn't just a house, it was a monument to their ingratitude. The company, under my interim leadership, began a slow and painful recovery. The first thing I did was call a meeting with the old guard, the loyal employees Mark and Jessica had marginalized. I sat down with Sal, my lead carpenter, and my core team. I didn't give them a speech about synergy or innovation. I spread the original blueprints for our first ever home on a dusty workbench. This is who we are, I told them, my voice thick with emotion. We build things that last. We build with integrity. We lost our way. It's time to come home. The process was brutal. We had to lay off the expensive, unnecessary consultants Jessica had hired. We had to cancel the contracts with the substandard overseas suppliers. We had to face the financial hole the Pinnacle project had dug. But with every hard decision, a sense of purpose returned to the company. The soul of Grayson Legacy Homes was slowly being pieced back together. I didn't hear from Jessica at all. Her silence was absolute. But Mark was a different story. About a month after the meeting, I received a letter. Not an email or a text, but a handwritten letter on simple, plain paper. It was from him. "Dad," it began, The handwriting shaky, unfamiliar. I've been trying to write this for weeks. There are no excuses for what I've done or what I allowed to happen. I stood by while Jessica disrespected you. I stood by while your legacy was erased. I stood on a stage and celebrated while my mother's memory was ignored. I was a coward. I was so afraid of not being seen as a modern leader, so afraid of losing Jessica's approval, that I lost myself instead, the cottage on the lawn. At first, I hated it. I saw it as a humiliation, but I've been looking at it every day. I see the craftsmanship. I see the care you put into it. It's not a punishment, it's a mirror. And I don't like the man I see reflected in it. I don't expect your forgiveness. I know I haven't earned it. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see everything. I am resigning from the board, and Jessica and I are separating. I need to figure out who I am without a title, without a brand, and without a house built on a lie. I need to learn how to be a Grayson again. Maybe one day I can learn how to be a son. I folded the letter and placed it in my top desk drawer. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a happy ending. But it was a beginning. It was the sound of a foundation, cracking under the weight of guilt and the first painful step towards rebuilding. I spent my time not in the grand CEO's office, but on the construction sites. I started a mentorship program, pairing my experienced master craftsmen with young apprentices from the Martha Grayson Scholarship Fund. I found joy again, not in profit margins, but in the smell of sawdust, in the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly joined corner, in seeing the spark of passion in a young builder's eyes. One Saturday afternoon, while I was sitting on the porch of the little cottage, just reading a book, a small figure appeared at the gate. It was my granddaughter, Sarah. She was alone. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at the little house, then at the big house, then back at me. "Can I come in, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice small. "Always," I said, my heart aching with a love that felt pure and uncomplicated. She sat on the steps of the porch, her gaze thoughtful. "Mom's gone," she said quietly. "She moved out last week. Dad is different now. He's quiet. He started cooking dinner. He's trying to teach me how to use a saw. He's not very good at it." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "He told me about the meeting," she continued, looking at me now, her eyes clear and honest. "He told me everything. About the money, the party, all of it. He said he failed you. He said he failed Grandma's memory." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. "I found your old journals," she said, her voice a little stronger. "The ones in the attic. I read them. I read about how you started, how much you loved Grandma. It's a better story than the one Mom and Dad were trying to write." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the clouds drift by. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a comfortable one. The kind that exists between two people who don't need words to understand each other. "Are you going to move in here?" she asked, gesturing to the cottage. I shook my head. "No, sweetheart. This house was never for me to live in. It was a lesson. It was a reminder. What are you going to do with it?" A new idea, one that had been slowly forming in the back of my mind, suddenly became clear. I think," I said slowly, "I'm going to give it to the best student from your grandmother's scholarship fund each year. A place for a young builder to live, rent-free, while they start their own legacy." Sarah's face lit up with a brilliant, beautiful smile. It was the first genuine smile I had seen in what felt like years. "Grandma would have loved that," she whispered. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for a decade. The rage was gone. The pain had softened into a scar. The justice I had sought wasn't about punishment or victory. It was about this. It was about sitting on a porch with my granddaughter, creating something new and hopeful out of the wreckage of the past. It was about turning a symbol of their betrayal into a beacon of opportunity for someone else. The legacy wasn't in the glass tower they had tried to build. It was in this small, simple act of reclamation and grace. A year can change everything. It doesn't erase the past, but it can reshape the landscape of the present. The grand house, the stage for their ambition, was finally sold. Mark didn't fight it. In his letter, he had told me he couldn't stand to live in the shadow of that mirror anymore. He took his share of the original equity, the part that existed, before my major contributions, and moved into a small, modest apartment in the city. He was starting over, not just financially, but fundamentally. He didn't rebuild his life with lawsuits or anger. He did it with his hands. I heard through Sal that Mark had shown up at one of our construction sites one day, not as a former CEO, but as a man looking for work. He started at the bottom, sweeping floors, carrying lumber. He was quiet, humbled, and for the first time in a very long time, he was learning. He was learning the value of a day's hard work, a lesson I had tried to teach him as a boy, a lesson he had to lose everything to finally understand. He didn't ask for my help. He didn't ask for my approval. He was simply building on his own terms. We started talking again. Not often, and not about the past. Our conversations were tentative, like two strangers learning a new language. He would call and ask for advice on a tricky joint he was trying to cut. I would offer guidance, father to son, builder to builder. There was no easy forgiveness, no magical reconciliation. There was just the slow, arduous work of laying a new foundation, one honest conversation at a time. The anger had faded, replaced by a quiet, cautious hope. I was getting to know my son again, or perhaps meeting him for the first time. Jessica disappeared from our lives. I heard she moved to the West Coast, chasing a new dream, a new brand, a new stage. I felt nothing about her departure. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a profound sense of emptiness for the life she had chosen to lead, one built on surfaces rather than substance. My life found a new rhythm. I officially retired, for good this time, appointing a new talented CEO from within the company's ranks, a woman who understood our history and respected our values. I spent my days in the community workshop, at the scholarship committee meetings, and, most importantly, with Sarah. Our bond, forged in the quiet moments of their family's storm, became the anchor of my later years. We would have lunch every Sunday. She would tell me about college, and I would tell her stories about her grandmother. Through her eyes, I saw Martha's legacy not as a memory to be protected, but as a living, breathing thing being carried into the future. One crisp afternoon, as Sarah and I were walking through a park, she stopped and looked at me, her expression serious. "Grandpa," she said, "do you ever miss it? The big company? Being in charge?" I thought for a moment, watching the autumn leaves fall, each one letting go without a fight. "No, sweetheart," I said, and the truth of it settled deep in my bones. I spent 40 years building houses for other people to live in. I think it's finally time I built a home for myself. And I had. My home was no longer a place of empty rooms and echoing memories. It was filled with the laughter of the scholarship students I mentored, the smell of sawdust from my workshop, and the quiet, steady presence of a granddaughter who saw me for who I was. That evening I was sitting on my own porch, the original porch Martha and I had sat on countless times, when a familiar beat-up truck pulled into my driveway. It was Mark. He didn't come to the door right away. He just got out, walked, over to a small, gnarled apple tree in my yard and placed a hand on its trunk. It was the tree we had planted together on his 10th birthday. He finally walked up the steps, his hands stained with wood varnish, a tired but peaceful look in his eyes. He wasn't carrying a gift. He wasn't carrying an apology. He was just carrying himself. The fence at the new apartment is falling apart, he said, a small wry smile on his face. I was wondering if I could borrow some of your old tools, the ones you taught me with. I looked at my son. The polished CEO was gone, replaced by a man covered in the honest dust of a day's work. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving something raw, something real. He wasn't asking for a handout. He was asking for a connection. He was asking to be taught again. I nodded slowly, a warmth spreading through my chest. Of course, son, I said, standing up. They're in the workshop. Let me show you. And while we're at it, I'll show you the right way to fix that fence. You're putting the braces in all wrong. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh. It was the sound I had been waiting a lifetime to hear again. In the end, justice isn't always a thunderous verdict in a courtroom. Sometimes it's a quiet conversation on a porch. It's not about winning or losing. It's about rebuilding. It's about a son learning that a legacy isn't something you inherit, but something you earn, one nail at a time. And it's about a father learning that the strongest thing you can ever build is a second chance. They tried to write me out of their story. But in the end, I wasn't just a chapter. I was the author, and I finally gave our story the ending it deserved. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more stories of justice and resilience, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, remember that the quietest voices often have the most powerful stories to tell.